Please be seated. The wilderness shall be glad, the desert shall rejoice and blossom, the burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. It's a lovely, bucolic image, isn't it? But just a chapter earlier, Isaiah says this: streams shall be turned to pitch, and its soil to sulfur. Its land shall become burning pitch. Night and day it shall never go out. Its smoke shall rise for all time. Much less inviting, right? So what happened between chapter 34 and chapter 35? What happened that turned burning pitch into springs of water? In March of 1980, several small earthquakes in increasing magnitude began to occur in the territory of the Cowlitz tribe. And locals feared that something big was about to happen in one of the active volcanoes nearby. And sure enough, on May 18th, 1980, the mountain that the Cowlitz called Lawetlatla, or the Smoker, exploded, sending a column of smoke and ash 80,000 feet into the air. Glaciers that had been on the mountain for centuries melted in an instant and became massive mudslides, carrying more than 3.9 million cubic yards of earth and rock and debris that flattened everything within 230 square miles. More than 1.5 million tons of sulfur dioxide was released into the air. Now, remarkably, only 57 humans, but thousands of large mammals and millions of fish and aquatic life were destroyed, along with 200 homes, 185 miles of highway, 15 miles of railway, all gone. Hundreds of square miles reduced to a wasteland. Its land shall become burning pitch. Night and day it shall never go out. Its smoke shall rise for all time. Through the ages it shall lie in ruins. Through the eons none shall traverse it. Isaiah chapter 34. As a white person, I know Lawetlatla as Mount St. Helens, and I was a teenager when it erupted, and I remember ash from that 80,000-foot plume of smoke falling in our yard in Colorado days and weeks after the explosion in Washington state. And if you remember seeing pictures of that devastation after that, it certainly seemed like the end had come for that area, that it would lie in ruins and be utterly uninhabitable for eons. But that's not what happened. Less than 3 months after the explosion, signs of freshly disturbed earth started turning up in the blast zone, and emerging from the ash were tiny northern pocket gophers who had been protected because they lived underground. And the very next year, prairie lupines appeared less than 4 miles from the crater, and these plants were not struggling to eke out a living, they were flourishing. And 40 years later, that devastated area is covered with plants and grasses and alders, and animals abound, and streams flow teeming with life. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. What happened? Philosopher and environmental activist Kathleen Dean Moore in her book, The Great Tide Rising, writes, "What the scientists now know that they didn't at the time is that when the mountain blasted ash and rock across the landscape, the devastation passed over some small hidden places in the lee of rocks and trees. Here, a bed of moss and deer fern under a rotting log. There, under a boulder, a patch of pearly everlasting and the tunnel to a vole's musty nest. These little pockets of safety and diversity and life are called refugia, as in refuge. Refugia are little sheltered pockets that survive, that preserve life, that become seeds of restoration and growth." Theologian Deborah Rienstra, in her book Refugia Faith, writes that we are living in a time of crisis eruption, and the future is uncertain. It always is. We do not know exactly what is coming. And it is at times like this, she says, when people of faith can be tempted in two directions. Either we start to close off and remove ourselves from society out of fear or disgust, hoping to wall off a space safe from pollutants where we can protect some fantasia of holiness and purity. In other words, we want to build a bunker. Or we are tempted to a kind of triumphalism, she says, in which we seek strategic dominance by infiltrating and controlling every aspect of society for God, as if God needs our human systems of dominance to squash out the competition. In other words, we become a beachhead in the battle for dominion. So those are our temptations, hiding or conquering. And we can hear echoes of both of these in our readings. In Isaiah, we can hear that bunker mentality, right? The faithful, the pure remnant traveling the highway in the desert, which shall be called the holy way, because the unclean shall not travel on it. No lion nor ravenous beast shall come upon it. And we hear echoes of the triumphalism in both Isaiah and in Mary's song of God coming to turn the world upside down with the strength of his arm, casting down the mighty from their thrones. And, we should probably get a head start on that. Those echoes are actually siren songs, luring us into bunkers or deploying us to our imagined beachheads. But there is another, more faithful lesson in our reading as well. In James's farmer, who lovingly tends that precious crop and waits patiently for both the early and the late rains, who encourages us to strengthen our hearts. And then, of course, there's Jesus, who reminds us that what we seek and what we see in the wilderness is prophetic. Now, clearly he means John, but remember, Jesus was also trained by and trained in the wilderness. The wilderness itself has prophetic powers, and we can learn much from it. Deborah Rienstra again. The earth and our scriptures teach that extreme disturbance can be survived and can even bring renewal. And one way this happens is through refugia. That's how God likes to work. God's preferred way, she says, seems less like walls and combat boots and more like a tray of seedlings. God seems to appreciate the humble, the permeable, the diverse, the surprising potentials of refugia. And she wonders, how can we, the church, become places of refugia. She imagines church communities as places where we are content to be small for a while, to wait, to be quiet, to practice simple virtues like hospitality and empathy, to be honest, to share our pain, share our joy, to rest from our fears and strivings, and practice some virtues, sense God's presence, build our capacity on a small scale, and prepare ourselves for regrowth. Because ultimately, friends, what turns burning pitch into springs of water is God's work. It's God's doing. Our task, it seems to me, is not to build bunkers or to establish beachheads, but rather to seek out the places in the world where refugia is already happening, and then to ask, how can we help? It's discerning places where refugia needs to happen, and then asking, how can we create that? And if we can do that, if we can receive the prophetic wisdom that cries out all around us and give those seeds some space to grow, then maybe, just maybe, we too will blossom and will join the desert in rejoicing when Christ comes again in glory. Amen.